There is a growing sentiment that our minds are seldom allowed to operate independently, not in an obvious way, but through a constant stream of input information, opinions, updates, snippets of others' thoughts. This creates a kind of cognitive environment that is always shifting. And within that flow, something subtle starts to change. It becomes increasingly challenging to distinguish between our own thoughts and those we have absorbed from external sources. Our thoughts seem less like conclusions we've reached and more like legacies we've inherited. As time progresses, this affects not only our thoughts, but also our understanding of the process of thinking itself. There's less of a pause between ideas, less room for something to fully develop before it's overshadowed or interrupted. In this context, peace is often envisioned as a result something that comes about when the external noise quiets down. However, what's less frequently considered is the environment in which our minds operate. It's not just about our physical surroundings, but also the patterns of our attention, the quality of the information we consume, and the speed at which we interact with the world. In this way, our inner lives are intertwined with our environment. They are shaped by it, continuously. Yet, because this shaping happens gradually and often goes unnoticed, it seldom becomes a topic of reflection. We adapt to the pace, the intensity, and the constant availability of things to engage with, until a certain kind of stillness starts to feel strange. Thus, the focus shifts from merely seeking peace to understanding the conditions that allow it to exist, not as a permanent state, but as something that can emerge or fade away depending on how we navigate our mental space. Today's discussion aims to delve into that relationship, not to rush into defining inner peace, but to examine more closely the environments we create, often without realizing it, and how they influence the quality of our inner experiences. Because perhaps what we refer to as peace isn't something far off or uncommon, but there's something that becomes accessible when the conditions are no longer working against it. When we take a closer look at how people engage with their minds today, just during stressful times, but in the everyday flow of life, what do you think has changed that makes the feeling of inner peace seem more elusive, even though we hear about it more often? Is it the sheer amount of information we consume, the speed at which we process it, or perhaps a deeper shift in our understanding of what peace truly means?
What stands out the most is not just the volume of information, but its constant presence. Nowadays, there are very few natural breaks. Our minds are almost always in a state of receiving, responding, or anticipating something. Even in moments that seem quiet, there's often a lingering engagement, a sort of low-level processing that continues in the background. Over time, this establishes a new normal, a state where constant engagement feels less like stimulation and more like the norm. Once this becomes the standard, anything quieter can feel inadequate or even a bit unsettling. Thus, the gap from inner peace isn't always stark. It's subtle, built through repeated exposure to conditions that prevent the mind from fully settling. Another change is in how we experience our thoughts. When our thoughts are regularly interrupted or diverted, they do not have the opportunity to develop completely. They remain incomplete or fade away before they can deepen. This leads to a kind of fragmentation, not just in our attention, but in the flow of our own thinking. And as our thinking becomes fragmented, our sense of coherence starts to diminish. Not in an obvious way, but enough that it becomes more challenging to feel grounded within ourselves. There's also a quiet shift in how we define peace. It is frequently imagined as a condition devoid of interruptions, a scenario in which no discomfort is present. In a mind that is always active, disturbances are nearly unavoidable. There's always something new being introduced, compared, or evaluated. As a result, peace can start to feel incompatible with everyday life, rather than something that can coexist within it. Another factor is the decreasing tolerance for stillness. Without regular moments of unstructured mental space, stillness can become confusing. There's no clear indication of progress or immediate feedback, which often leads to it being seen as unproductive or even a bit disorienting. Consequently, the mind tends to shy away from it, not consciously, but as a habit. All of this creates an internal environment where peace isn't absent, but rather hidden. It's less about something lacking and more about something being constantly interrupted. And since these interruptions are small and frequent, they often go unchallenged. They simply blend into the fabric of daily life. When people talk about inner peace, they often do so from a place that makes it hard to recognize, let alone maintain. Not because peace itself has drifted further away, but because the mental environment has become less supportive of it.
When considering the concept of a mental environment, it may seem abstract, something that continuously shapes us while remaining largely unseen. Do you think people are aware of the kind of environment their mind operates in? Or does that influence tend to stay hidden? If it does go unnoticed, how does it manifest in a person's experience? Perhaps not as a clear realization, but as something subtler, like a change in mood, clarity, or the quality of their focus.
For the most part, it goes unnoticed, not because it's intentionally hidden, but because it's a constant presence. When something is always there, it tends to fade from our awareness. Our minds adapt to their surroundings, even if those surroundings aren't particularly helpful. Instead of directly acknowledging the environment, people often feel its effects. These effects can be quite subtle. There's a certain kind of mental fatigue that's hard to pin down. It's not physical tiredness. Rather, it's a feeling that thinking requires more effort than it used to. You might also notice a decrease in your attention span. It's not that you can't focus at all, but it's harder to stay engaged with something without getting distracted. Thoughts are interrupted more easily, making it challenging to follow an idea through to its conclusion. This can lead to a quiet frustration, as the mind feels fragmented but struggles to identify why. Emotionally, the impact shows up in small ways. You might find yourself getting irritated more quickly or feeling overwhelmed with less provocation. Sometimes, there's even a sense of dullness. Experiences don't seem as vivid or engaging, even with constant stimulation. This can be puzzling, as we often assume that more input should lead to greater engagement. But the opposite can occur. When the mind is bombarded with a lot of information, its ability to perceive depth can lessen. Everything starts to feel a bit flat, not because it lacks substance, but because there's no room for it to be fully absorbed. Another way this manifests is in our relationship with silence. When there's a brief moment without external input, it can create a subtle discomfort. It's not necessarily anxiety, but rather a feeling that something is lacking. The mind, used to constant stimulation, doesn't quite know how to settle down. So there's a tendency to reach out again. Interestingly, these patterns often become normalized. People often see these issues as personal shortcomings like trouble focusing, feeling drained, or mood swings rather than recognizing them as reactions to the surrounding environment. As a result, the environment itself goes unnoticed. It continues to influence our experiences quietly, without being acknowledged as a contributing factor. Thus, when awareness starts to develop, it's less about uncovering something new and more about realizing that something has always been there. It's a gradual realization that the nature of our inner experiences isn't random. It's deeply connected to what our minds are consistently exposed to and how we are permitted or not permitted to process those experiences.
When someone starts to realize more clearly that their inner experience is intertwined with what they are constantly exposed to, what usually changes first? Not in terms of a conscious effort to change, but rather in the quality of their awareness. Does the mind become more discerning, more attuned, or maybe even a bit more anxious at the beginning? I'm interested in understanding what that initial phase looks like when a person begins to perceive their mental landscape as a static entity, but as something that is subtly influencing them in real time.
What often shifts first is our sensitivity. It's not about clarity in knowing exactly what to do, but rather a heightened awareness of what's already occurring. Things that used to go unnoticed start to stand out more clearly: the tone of a conversation, the speed of information flow, even the way certain thoughts linger after we've been exposed to them. This can feel a bit disorienting at first. What was once in the background now comes to the forefront. The mind begins to recognize not just that it is thinking, but also what has influenced those thoughts and how quickly they can change based on what it has encountered. There's often a phase where this heightened sensitivity feels like instability. A person might find themselves more easily affected, more attuned to subtle shifts in mood or focus. It can seem as if something has become less resilient, when in reality, it has become more perceptive. With this perception comes a certain hesitation. The automatic tendency to check, scroll, or engage starts to slow down, not out of force, but because the after effects are more apparent. There's a faint awareness that not everything leaves the mind unchanged. This doesn't immediately lead to restraint. Instead, it creates a gap. A small space between impulse and action where one can observe before acting. At the same time, there may be a heightened awareness of internal residue. Thoughts or impressions that linger longer than anticipated, a conversation replaying in the mind. A piece of information affecting mood without a clear reason. These residues were always there, but they weren't recognized as part of an ongoing environment. Now, they start to form a pattern. As these patterns become visible, there's a gradual change in how attention is distributed. Not through strict control, but through a kind of quiet discernment. Certain types of input begin to feel heavier and more demanding, while others seem neutral or even restorative. This isn't always consistent, but it becomes more noticeable over time. Another subtle shift is in how we engage with our surroundings. There's less pressure to respond to everything right away. Our minds start to accept brief pauses, those moments when we aren't taking in information or acting on anything. While these pauses may be short, they change the overall rhythm. And within that new rhythm, something begins to find its balance, not as a permanent state, but as a growing awareness of how our minds interact with the world around us. We start to realize that our inner experiences are not separate, they're influenced, shaped, and often relational. This understanding doesn't solve everything right away, but it shifts our perspective. From being completely absorbed in our environment without realizing it, to being slightly more aware, allowing us to notice how it impacts us as it happens.
When individuals start to explore the concept of shaping their mental environment, they often tend to either oversimplify it or make it too rigid. What do you think is the most common misunderstanding about nurturing inner peace in this context? This includes how people approach it, their expectations, and how they interpret their experiences throughout the process.
One common misunderstanding is the belief that achieving inner peace means eliminating all disturbances. Many people feel the need to treat their minds as if they should be completely cleared, filtered, or shielded from anything that might cause friction. While having some discernment is natural, this mindset can become limiting. It suggests that peace is something delicate, something that relies on carefully controlled circumstances. In reality, the mind is always engaged with something. Even in quieter settings, thoughts pop up, memories come to mind, and associations are made. Disturbance, in some form, is part of our mental landscape. When people believe that peace equates to the complete absence of any mental activity, they frequently arrive at the conclusion that it is an impossible goal. Another misconception is the tendency to overstructure the process of finding peace. Once the impact of the mental environment becomes apparent, there may be an urge to manage it meticulously, to curate what we take in, control our focus, and create an ideal internal state. While this can feel stabilizing at first, it often brings about a different kind of pressure. The mind becomes something that requires ongoing management. In the effort to keep it that way, a subtle tension arises. There's a feeling that any deviation from the desired state must be corrected. This can make the inner environment feel less spacious, even if it's more controlled. Additionally, there is often confusion between being aware and choosing to avoid. Becoming more attuned to certain inputs can lead to completely withdrawing from them, not out of clarity, but out of discomfort. While this might provide temporary relief, it doesn't necessarily enhance one's relationship with their mind. In reality, this can restrict it. The environment may become quieter, but also more fragile, as it relies on exclusion rather than understanding. Another factor is the expectation of consistency. People often think that once they start relating differently to their mental environment, the experience should quickly stabilize. They expect a noticeable and lasting sense of calm to follow. The mind does not transform in a simple or direct way. There are times of clarity and times when old habits come back. When this occurs, it's often seen as a setback instead of a part of a broader journey toward understanding. Moreover, many believe that achieving inner peace is a goal to reach. They think that with enough focus, one can find a state where the mind is permanently calm. Nevertheless, what typically occurs is not a fixed state, but instead a novel approach to engaging with the continuous changes. Thoughts persist in their arrival and departure. Emotions vary. The environment surrounding us continues to change. What changes is how much we let ourselves be swept away by it all. In this light, peace is less about trying to control everything around us and more about learning to stay present within it without being unconsciously influenced. It doesn't replace movement. Instead, it coexists with it, allowing us to navigate life without needing to eliminate the chaos.
If we start to view the mind not as something to control, but rather as a space to inhabit, one that has its own rhythms, influences, and conditions, how does that change the way we engage with our thoughts, our focus, and even the tempo of our inner experiences? Does this alter our internal role from merely managing the mind to experiencing it in a new way?
The change is subtle, but it alters how we relate to our own experiences. When we view the mind as something to be controlled, we create a separation within ourselves. A part of us takes on the role of a manager, while our thoughts, emotions, and impulses become things to be organized. This leads to an internal hierarchy, where some states are favored and others are pushed away. However, when we see the mind as an environment, that hierarchy starts to dissolve. We focus less on deciding which thoughts should be present and more on how they emerge, how they flow, and what they connect to. The emphasis shifts from trying to correct to simply observing. This doesn't mean being passive. Instead, the main action becomes awareness rather than interference. Within that awareness, patterns start to emerge in a more cohesive manner. For instance, a recurring thought isn't viewed as something to get rid of. Instead, it's understood in relation to its context, what came before it, what usually follows, and how it influences the overall atmosphere of our inner world. This relational perspective alters how we direct our attention. Rather than focusing solely on what feels urgent or disruptive, our attention can be more evenly spread. It can rest on the quieter parts of our experience, not just the loudest ones. This fosters a more balanced understanding of what's happening inside us. Another change is in the pace of our thoughts. Control tends to speed up our thinking because it aims for resolution. It wants to reach a conclusion or settle things. When we let go of that need, the pace naturally slows down. Thoughts aren't rushed to completion. They're allowed to unfold or even fade away without fully forming. This transforms our experience of time in the mind. Moments feel less crammed together. There's more space between thoughts. Even when there's activity, it doesn't feel as overwhelming. There's a noticeable change in how we deal with discomfort. In a control-focused mindset, discomfort is something we aim to eliminate. However, when we adopt an environment-focused perspective, we start to see discomfort as something to comprehend within its context. It's still experienced, but we don't rush to react. This approach fosters a sense of stability, not because the surroundings are always peaceful, but because we stop trying to force them into a specific state. Over time, this leads to a new kind of familiarity. The mind shifts from being something to fix or improve to a space we inhabit with mindful awareness. Changes are still noticeable, but they become less jarring. A sense of continuity emerges, not because everything remains the same, but because we stay connected to the ever-changing environment without feeling the need to step away to control it. Within that continuity, a quieter form of steadiness arises. This steadiness doesn't rely on the absence of movement, but rather on our capacity to stay present as that movement occurs.
In a world where our attention is constantly drawn outward toward information, responses, and interactions, why does cultivating a quieter, more intentional relationship with our own mental space start to feel like clarity? Not in the typical sense of being exclusive, but in the way we experience it. What is it about this inner calm, this capacity to engage with our thoughts without constant distractions, that makes it seem so rare or even quietly precious?
The text starts by highlighting how rare certain conditions are. This isn't due to their complexity in practical terms, but rather because they contradict the usual way we engage our attention. Most settings are designed to keep our minds active, responsive, and focused outwardly. There's a constant push to move, react, and take in information. Staying with one's own experience, without jumping into that external movement, is no longer the norm. When that inward calm is present, it has a unique quality not because it's complicated, but because it's untroubled. There's also something special about how attention flows. Often, our attention is split among various thread-scattered thoughts, partial engagements, and fragmented awareness. When we allow our attention to settle in one spot, even for a moment, the experience becomes richer. Not in terms of content, but in its depth. A single thought can be pursued without interruption. A feeling can be felt without being overshadowed. This creates a sense of coherence that is hard to find when our attention is constantly shifting. That coherence is valuable because it brings a sense of internal harmony. Another important point is the lack of pressure. Much of what we interact with comes with an unspoken expectation to respond, interpret, or position ourselves in relation to it. Even passive consumption often requires a subtle form of engagement. In a quieter mental space, that pressure diminishes. In those moments, the mind isn't being asked to produce, decide, or compare. It can simply be, without needing to aim for a specific outcome. This lack of pressure fosters a sense of ease that is rarely experienced. Time also shifts in a noticeable manner. When the mind isn't jumping from one engagement to another, time isn't broken down into tasks or intervals. It feels more fluid. A few moments can seem more expansive, not because they last longer, but because they are less interrupted. This changes the feeling of urgency. There's less pressure to rush ahead or to reach a different destination. The present moment becomes a space that can be fully experienced. Within that space, there's a quiet sense of being enough. Not as a final point, but as a fundamental state. The feeling that the current experience doesn't need anything added or improved to feel complete. In a world where much of the outside environment is crafted to keep that feeling just out of reach by presenting endless options and constant upgrades, this sense of sufficiency feels rare. Not because it's remarkable, but because it's no longer being pushed aside. So, the feeling of clarity doesn't stem from gaining something new. It arises from the lack of interruptions, the flow of attention, and the absence of relentless demands. These are simple conditions, yet they are seldom maintained. And because they are seldom maintained, their presence is felt more clearly. Not as something dramatic, but as something quietly whole.
If someone were to take a moment to pause and observe the environment of their own mind without trying to change it or filter it, but simply noticing what is already there, what do you think they might gradually start to realize? Not right away, but as that observation deepens and becomes more consistent.
At first, individuals may realize how little of their inner experience feels entirely self-contained. Thoughts often carry remnants of their origins, something heard earlier, something glimpsed in passing, a tone or idea absorbed without much thought. What seems personal starts to feel more permeable, not in a disorienting manner, but in a way that highlights how interconnected the inner landscape is with everything it has encountered. As this realization deepens, a growing awareness of rhythm emerges. The mind is not static. It flows in patterns, times of density, where thoughts feel crowded or repetitive, and times when there is more space between them. These transitions are often subtle, but they become more apparent when one isn't trying to intervene. Alongside this, there may be a recognition of residue. Certain experiences leave behind traces in emotional tone, a lingering thought, a slight shift in mood that lasts longer than anticipated. These residues may not always be strong, but they quietly accumulate, shaping the overall atmosphere of the mind. What becomes evident is that the inner environment is influenced not only in the moment, but also by what lingers afterwards. There is also a gradual transformation in how silence is perceived. What may have initially felt empty or chaotic starts to reveal more nuance. Silence is no longer merely the absence of sound, it possesses its own texture. Subtle thoughts arise, pass, and give way to others. There is movement, but it feels less urgent. Within that, a different kind of attention becomes possible, one that doesn't need to chase every thought or resolve every feeling. Attention can rest, momentarily, without clinging to what surfaces. Over time, this fosters a sense of distance, not separation, but space. Thoughts and emotions remain present, yet they are not as immediate or consuming. They are viewed as part of the environment rather than as defining aspects of the self. And perhaps most quietly, there is a shift in how much needs to be addressed. The urge to change, interpret, or enhance begins to fade. This isn't because everything is clear, but rather because it becomes evident that not every detail needs a reaction. Some things can simply be acknowledged and allowed to drift away. What they may come to realize is not a new state of being, but a different kind of relationship. It's a way of engaging with the mind where observation takes the place of constant engagement, and where the environment, even with its ups and downs, can be experienced without a sense of urgency.
Perhaps inner peace isn't something we need to build or strive for intentionally. It might already be present in the quieter parts of our minds, hidden beneath the constant flow of thoughts and the influx of information. What changes is not the existence of peace itself, but rather the surroundings that either hide it or allow it to emerge. When our environment becomes more open, less cluttered, and less demanding, something starts to settle naturally. It's not a final destination, but rather a recurring opportunity. It's a way of existing where the mind isn't always racing or being influenced by external factors, but is instead gently supported by conditions that align with its natural pace. In this way, peace isn't something far away. It becomes noticeable when the circumstances no longer hinder it.